We are going to sculpt, remesh and texture a horror character in Blender. Even if you've never done a project like this before, you will be devouring human souls after this tutorial. I'm using Blender 4.0 and I'll try to explain as much as I can about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it this way. To get started, I choose two of my references for the head shape and imported them into Blender as images. Avoid using image as planes for modeling and sculpting references, as they aren't visible in the viewport or wireframe mode. I've included links to these images in the description if you would like to follow along, but feel free to use your own references. Begin by using the front and side orthographic views to position both images to fit within the frame of a cube. You can use the numpad keys 1 and 3 or the gizmo or widget next to the transformation and outliner information. Then select your cube, press Tab to switch to edit mode and create a vertical loop cut with Ctrl R in the middle. Activate Circle Select by pressing C to easily select multiple vertex points without clicking each one individually. Delete one side of the cube to prepare for using a mirror modifier to symmetrize the left side with the right side. You will find the mirror modifier in the Modifier tab. Click Add Modifier and select the mirror modifier. Ensure clipping is enabled to keep the mesh closed during mirroring. Add some loop cuts to roughly model the shape of the head. You can control the number of cuts with your mouse wheel. I added 1 vertical and 3 horizontal loop cuts to create 8 quads on each side. Then simply drag the vertices to match the outline of the head. It doesn't have to be perfect. Repeat these steps in the side view and then adjust the vertices in perspective mode to refine the shape. Don't forget to create the neck by extruding the faces. We will create the rest of the body later. For now, let's focus on the head, which is the most important part. Go to the Modifier tab and add a Subdivision Surface modifier, increasing the level viewport to 2. You can apply the modifiers individually with Ctrl A and ensure the top modifier is applied first. Save your project and switch to Sculpting tab. I disabled the reference images to avoid creating a Slenderman copy, aiming instead to create a creature with a similar shape. You will see various brushes on the left side, but for our model we will mostly use the standard draw brush. It rises the mesh while drawing, and holding Ctrl does the opposite. Holding Shift smooths out mesh parts, and the brush size controlled with F and brush strength with Shift F. Enable mesh symmetry and let your creativity guide you. Sculpt the face to your liking, focusing on larger details first, increasing subdivisions when needed. It's like drawing an image, just in 3D. It's very creative and many ways leads to a great result. And by the way, if you have a drawing tablet, use it. Sculpting with a mouse, like I did and I'm still doing it this way, is just donkey shit in a box. Once you've finished sculpting, it's necessary to optimize your topology for animations. But we will come to that point in a minute. First, let's create some teeth for our character. Again, use a cube with a Subdivision Surface modifier and switch to Edit mode. Deform it to resemble canines, then increase the subdivisions with the modifier and sculpt 3 different versions of canine teeth. Use the pinch brush for sharper details. To keep things organized, move them to a separate collection. Now it's time to ensure the topology of our head is correct, especially for animating purposes. Begin by adding a plane and rotating it 90 degrees in the x-axis. Enable the Snap Width option and choose Face Nearest under Snap to Individual Elements to from the drop-down menu. Move the plane to the front of the head, scale it down between the eye sockets, create a loop cut in the middle and delete the right side. Add the mirror modifier to ensure symmetry, and now, whenever you move a vertex, it will automatically snap to the surface of our sculpted mesh, simplifying the remesh process a lot. Extrude the edges to fill the area between the eyes. Rather than simply creating a circle around the eye, use the side edges and extrude new faces to follow the shape of the eye socket. This method ensures proper topology for filling the rest of the head. Ideally, maintain the same number of faces above and below, as well as left and right, for the eye socket itself. Next, fill the gap between the mouth area and the eyes by extruding the edges. Press G to move multiple vertices and they will automatically snap to the closest surface point. It's also helpful to duplicate an edge line to maintain the same number of vertices and shape the outline of the mouth area. Use Ctrl E with Bridge Edge Loop to combine both mesh parts together, and F to fill single faces. Follow the same workflow for the rest of the head. Consider the shape and how the geometry should follow, breaking the quad lines where it makes sense. If your polygon positions are messy, select them, right-click, and choose Smooth Vertices. Increase the repeat option in this little menu here, and press G without moving your mouse to snap all vertices back to the head in a more organized way. At the back of the head, reduce the polygon count since it's generally less visible due to hair, hoods, etc. Close the mesh at the back of the neck and create a proper jawline, ensuring there is enough geometry between the neck and jawline for animating. Extrude the edge loop of the neck and add a couple of loop cuts to complete the head shape. Now let's create the eye sockets. Select the edge loop with Alt and left click, extrude it backwards and add some loop cuts. Disable the snapping option, extrude the edge loop, scale it down and connect 4 vertices to one face. Start with these 2 opposite ones. Press F to connect them and Ctrl R to add another vertice. Now select these 4 vertices and press F to fill them. Repeat this until the mesh is closed. Add more loop cuts, select the inside of the socket, right-click and choose Smooth Vertices to create a nicely shaped eye socket. The last step is the mouth. For the skin folds, extrude every edge individually, scaling each edge loop down and bridging between them with F. Ensure there is space for 2 more faces between each face strand previously bridged. Don't forget to add horizontal loop cuts to each of them to properly close the mesh later. It's time to save your project and create a backup of your remeshed head. Apply the mirror modifier and add the subdivision surface modifier, then apply it. In object mode, right-click and select Shade Smooth. If there are any weird shaded lines, go to Edit mode, select everything and press Alt-N to recalculate the normals outside. Switch to Sculpt mode again. In the Object tab under Viewport Display, enable Wireframe, and this allows us to sculpt the skin ripples in the mouth areas, including where the teeth are, according to the topology of our mesh. Use the crease brush to draw lines following the topology of the mouth section. It's like a pinch and an inverted dwarf brush combined. Vise the area where the teeth are under the skin and smooth everything out. Repeat this process as needed and use the pinch brush to further refine. You might ask, why are we doing this twice? The first mesh we sculpted the head shape on was purely creative and artistic. Focusing on topology and specific rules would have prevented the creative process. Additionally, you need less geometry to shape the look you want if you create the topology around the messy sculpted mesh. Now let's create the gum evaluation for the teeth. The blob brush is a nice tool for this, but you can also use the basic draw brush. After that, we are pretty much done with the sculpting part. We need to position the teeth in the eye sockets, rotate and scale each tooth to make them less repetitive. Also add some teeth behind the front row for a more disgusting look. We are creating a monster, not a human. For the molten skin effect, delete some faces outside of the teeth area and bridge them with Ctrl E. Add loop cuts until the topology matches the rest of your head. Best way is to count both edge loops and make sure they are equal amount of vertices. Smooth the bridged faces in sculpting mode, being careful not to overdo it. Deform the threads with the grab brush. Repeat this process for the other side, but don't use a mirror modifier to avoid a generic look. To make the mouth more realistic, add teeth and depth to block the light for subsurface scattering. Duplicate the area of the mouth and put it to a new selection with Ctrl P. Add teeth to the appropriate places. Hide the head to see your work. Use a mirror modifier again and tweak the position of each tooth. Finally, switch to sculpting mode and use the draw brush to cover each tooth, giving the appearance that the skin has grown directly over them. To block light for the entire mouth, select the duplicated section and use Alt and left click to select the outside edges. Invert the selection with Ctrl E and delete it. Create a circle with the same number of vertices as the edge loop. Bridge them and scale to fill the area. Deselect every second vertice with checker deselect. Merge all vertices in the center with M and ensure the center point is selected. Then select the next edge loop and press F to create quads. Add loop cuts and smooth the vertices. Now we are done with the modeling part. It's time to unwrap our mesh. To unwrap properly, we need to tell Blender where the mesh should be cut. Select edge loops that are hidden in most perspectives, such as behind the chin, ears, if your model has some, inside the eye sockets and behind the neck, and so on. For this specific head, I selected the edge loop behind the chin and connected it to the top of the head. I also extended the loop to the back of the neck. I made a cut behind the skin threads in the eye sockets. And for the threads themselves, I added loop cuts to each end and one for each side to ensure proper unfolding in the UV editor. This process may take some time, but it's crucial for a good final result. It's always better to do it right from the start. Finally, I added the edge loop to the back of the head. Now in the UV tab, click on Mark Seam to indicate Blender where the mesh needs to be unfolded. Then go back to the UV tab and click on Unwrap. This process may take some time depending on your poly count. For our skin, we will create fully procedural texture, but not a beautiful clean skin. Instead, with wrinkles, grooves, alt and a bit rotten, but still human. Begin by creating a new material and delete the principal BSDF. Replace it with the subsurface scatter node. Before using any nodes, create a color. The best approach is to paint the color individually. So switch to the texture paint section, open the texture slots, click the little plus sign and select base color. Use a resolution of at least 2K or higher. And for the color, you can use a hex code for a white skin tint or any color you prefer. After selecting the color, save the image. Remember to save all texture painted images individually to avoid deletion when reopening Blender. If you select the draw brush, you can paint in two different colors by holding Ctrl. One color is the skin tint we created, and the other one should be more reddish for areas with more blood saturation, such as around the mouth and eyes. Set the blending mode to mix so you can paint over each color. Enable the paint option in the UV editor to paint directly onto your UV map. Start with the eye sockets, blending colors to create a gradient effect. Do the same for the mouth section. making the gums appear more reddish like inflamed flesh. Brighten the area around the teeth behind the skin using the Add Blend mode. Use the Smear and Soften brush to blend colors smoothly. After completing the painting process, we turn to Layout and connect the automatically added texture in your shader editor to the subsurface scatter node. And now you see how it looks like if you have forgotten to save your painted results. Lol. Next, add the Voronoi texture with Shift A and use Ctrl T to add mapping and texture coordinate nodes. Set the Voronoi from F1 to distance to edge and use a very high value for the scale. Set the detail to 1, roughness to 0.75 and linearity to 2.7. Then add a color ramp, adjust the white color to 0.225 and plug the output into a bump node. This will be our first layer for the skin, providing some basic structure. Increase the strength of the bump node to make it more visible in the viewport. Change the texture coordinate to UV and set the Y scale to 0.5. But this depends to your UV map, so maybe you need to change the scale differently to achieve a similar look. Duplicate the Voronoi and color ramp and change the scale of the Voronoi texture to 175 and switch it to 4D. Add the noise texture and use a mix color node to combine the output of the mapping node with the noise texture. Add another mix color node and set it to overlay. Use both color ramps as inputs and adjust the factor to 1. Since it looks way too distorted, decrease the factor of this mix node to 0.1 or 0.05 and increase the roughness of this noise texture. Again, duplicate the Voronoi texture and the color ramp and increase the scale to 500 this time. And change the W value to randomize it more. As input, use also the mix node and for the output add another bump node. Put this bump node to the first one and set the strength to 0.075. Duplicate another bump node and use the second color ramp as input. Use this bump node as a normal input for the second one. Enable the invert box and increase the strength to 0.1. In the last step, duplicate the mapping, noise and mix color node and again also the Voronoi and color ramp. Change the white value of the color ramp to 0.125, the roughness of the Voronoi texture to 0.5 and the scale to 30. A last bump node with a strength of 0.15 combined it with the normal input of the third bump node. Keep in mind adding multiple bump nodes together leads to a negative impact for your performance. You can use more mix color nodes to combine each layer and use one final bump node in the end to avoid this problem a bit. But for me it still worked fine this way. So I leave it as it is. The next part is very optional and just for a still render later, not for an animated character. But I wanted to use also a displacement node. So I added a mix color node, set to multiply and used the last color ramp as input. I used a 4D noise texture with specific values for W, scale and detail and plugged it into a color ramp. For the black value, I used 0.5 and for the white value, 0.7. The result goes into the second input of the multiply node, and this goes into the height of the displacement node and into the displacement slot of the material output. The scale of the displacement node has to be very low, something like 0.005. I did this for a deep wrinkle effect, so I had to increase the scale of the second mapping node, but just in one direction. In my case, it was the X direction. Unfortunately, this part of my recording is corrupted, but 99% was done. I just changed the strength of the first bump node back to 0.1. That was, by the way, the reason why it looked a bit strange before. Also, I increased the scale of the last vowel noise texture to decrease the wrinkle size. And don't worry if you didn't understand everything or couldn't follow each step. Here's my shader setup so far, so pause the video if you want to copy my settings. For each teeth, add a vowel noise texture with a detail of 1 and a scale between 15 and 20. Use Ctrl-T to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes, and use it as the base color input. Adjust the scale to 5, and for more distortion, add a noise texture with the texture coordinate and the mapping node with a color mix node. Finally, add a color ramp and drag the white value to 0.1. Add a bump node with a strength of 0.15 and duplicate the bump node and add a noise texture to it for worn out teeth effect. Adjust the color to a slightly yellow tint. That's it for now for the procedural node setups. Now let's create the slime in the eye sockets. I used a free add-on for this. To install the add-on, go to Edit, Preferences and click on Install. Now you will have a new menu next to the outliner. After selecting two objects, you can click on Add Slime. And initially it might look strange, but you can adjust the settings according to your mesh size. If you followed my setup, you can use my settings here. However, if not, you may need different values for radius, viscosity and density. For the radius, I set it between 0.05 and 0.2. I set proximity object 1 and 2 to 1 to cover each tooth completely with slime. I reduced the length curve definition to 2 or 3 and deleted the extra subdivisions for object 1 and 2. Viscosity should be between 0.02 and 0.05 and density between 20 and 150, depending on how much slime you want. Before covering everything with slime, let's check the material the slime comes with. I left everything as it was, just reduced the alpha to 0.15 because we will stack a lot of slime on top of each other. Now repeat this process until it matches your artistic look. Consider adding an extra layer of slime for each tooth by duplicating them, scaling them up a bit, and giving them the slime material. Finally, duplicate some parts of the eye sockets, separate them into a new selection, and use them as emitter for the slime add-on too. You need to set the pivot point to each mesh so this add-on can work right. And as we all know, slime is wet, so the skin around it should be wet as well. That's where we create our roughness map. Switch to texture painting again and add a new texture. This time set it to roughness and use a gray color with a resolution of 2K again. Before we start painting, open your shader editor and delete the subsurface scatter node. We need the principled BSDF again. Set up the subsurface scatter settings like we did in the separate subsurface scatter node. Put the roughness texture we created into the roughness slot of the BSDF and use a black color for now to make it visible while painting. So for painting, use white and black colors with a medium strength and start painting everything that should be wet and slimy. To get more realistic transitions between dry and wet areas, paint black and white on top of each other to create noisy, distorted transitions. Save your paintings and reconnect all other nodes to your BSDF. The transition between slime, skin and teeth is still too harsh. To make it smoother and way more realistic, we can add a particle system in these areas. Switch to weight paint mode and start covering all areas with some weight. It's very similar to texture painting, just with weights for each vertex point. When you are done, go to Add and choose Metaball Ball. When you duplicate these objects, they are automatically connected within the effect radius. Also add an icosphere with a low resolution for some variations and move both reference objects to an extra collection. Give these objects the same slime material as the add-on comes with. Add a particle system to your mesh, set it to hair, and reduce the hair length to 1 to match the original size of your reference objects. Under Render, switch the reference to Collection and use your collection with both references. Set the scale to 1 and randomness to 0.5. Enable interpolated children and set the render amount to 30 or something like that. Lastly, under Vertex Group, use your weight painted group for density and length. Finally, you've done a lot of work to get to this point, but one thing is still missing. Veins. Let's create another base color texture in the texture paint mode. But this time in 4K. We won't paint with a simple brush. Open the texture mask menu, click on New, give it a name and use this little icon next to it to switch directly to the texture properties. The type has to be image or movie to open an image as your brush. After a lot of testing, I got some pretty nice results with a black and white lightning texture. Once it's set, we can paint veins, but we can't see it on your model right now. That's why we need to switch to our shader editor and use this second color texture as input. If you go back to texture painting, you will see the painted result. Paint around the eyes. All the time I had The Witcher in my mind, where Geralt took the elixir and that looked so cool. I wanted this type of effect for this character. By the way, why are we still using black and white as colors? Because we use this texture later as a mask for our first color texture we just created. And don't forget to save your image. Use an invert color node for the vein texture and connect it with the color ramp. Set the black value to 0.35 and change the color to a dark red. I used hex code I find for blood. Then add a mix color node and use the first color texture and the color ramp as inputs. Increase the factor to 1 and change the blending mode to multiply. Duplicate the vein texture and make a single copy of it. That's how you can control it separately. Change the color space to non-color. Create a final bump node, put the vein copy into the bump and use the bump as the first input for the BSDF. Set the strength to 0.2 and reconnect the other bump node into the normal input of the new main bump. And lastly, put the color and displacement back and check the final result. Congratulations, you've created a pretty solid looking character head without using any assets or other software, just directly in Blender. In the next part, we will create the body and also animate this guy to create awesome horror cinematics. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, even if it was a bit longer and more complex. Leave a like if you want, and if you have any questions, write them down in the comments below. I will try my best to help you out. Stay tuned for the next part, and I'll see you in the next one.